Chapter 6. The Outward Journey and the Inward Journey. Forerun by mind are mental states, ruled by mind, made of mind. If you speak or act with corrupt mind, sorrow follows you as the wheel the foot of an ox. Forerun by mind are mental states, ruled by mind, made of mind. If you speak or act with clear mind, happiness follows you, like a shadow that does not depart. The Dhammapada, Chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Chapter 4 and 5 dealt with foreshadow figures who prepare the way for the archetype of the self in symbolic rather than personified form. This chapter brings the focus back to more traditional ego-shadow or self-foreshadow relationships with the ancient Eastern traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. From a Western perspective, these two religions seem to have much in common, and yet it is their central distinctions that are of more relevance to this study. Like the narratives of ancient Egypt or ancient Greece, the tradition of Hinduism is extremely mythological in nature. If taken literally, the colorful pantheon of gods, the fantastical array of beasts and demons, and the superhuman feats performed by heroes and deities might not be relatable in day-to-day life. But when viewed symbolically, the complex narratives reveal their truth, whether that truth is absorbed on a psychological or religious level. As such, this chapter views Hanuman, the immortal, shape-shifting monkey god and ultimate devotee of Lord Rama, as a uniquely conspicuous example of the foreshadow archetype. As we will see, Hanuman's wild appearance and extraordinary abilities are vibrant mythological images of psychological qualities that define the foreshadow archetype. If Hinduism is a mythological religion, Buddhism is a particularly psychological one, so much so that Buddhist teachings and practices are virtually interchangeable with the of Siddhartha Gautama, the prince who rejected his future kingdom for an inward journey of self-discovery, subverts the typical Indian epic by, in a sense, pulling the mythical projections back and placing them within the mind of an introverted hero. In place of Lord Rama, the blue-skinned and super-strong avatar of Vishnu, there is the all-too-human Siddhartha, where Rama finds himself on an outward quest to save his bride and defeat the ten-headed demon king. Siddhartha takes an inward path and battles the many rearing heads of his own ego to obtain Buddhahood or enlightenment. Rama's traditional hero journey ends with the triumphant reclaiming of his throne, but Siddhartha never accepts his crown, instead bringing back the boon of a new spiritual path for his people and all of humanity. The magical weapons and endless battles, the mentors, allies, and monsters of Siddhartha's hero journey are all internalized. They are introverted and, as Hillman would say, psychologized. In this sense, the future Buddha also draws his foreshadow into himself. Thus far, this study has explored embodied foreshadow archetypes who, like John the Baptist, Merlin, Elijah, and the Old Testament prophets, are split off from ego consciousness of their respective narratives. But the Buddha is not bodily separated from his foreshadow. Accepting the Faustian realities of the human condition, Siddhartha Gautama acknowledges that, quote, two souls alas dwell in his breast. End quote. Chapter 6 therefore concludes by exploring the ways in which Siddhartha's phase of extreme asceticism in the wilderness foreshadows the birth of the Buddha within. The Outward Journey, Hanuman, Foreshadow of Rama. Hail to thee, son of the wind, messenger of Rama, harbinger of light and life. Matavi Devi Vanamali Hanuman, the devotion and power of the monkey god, page 377. Unlike the majority of world religions, Hinduism does not have a founding figure or a hard and fast start date. Believers will date ad nauseum the particular year, month, day, or hour of the birth of Christ, the Hajj of Muhammad, or the Buddha's enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree, or of Moses' descent from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments. And scientists may claim that these events never actually happened. And yet, these religions nevertheless began at some point, and there are many benefits to a well-defined origin story. But Hinduism, sometimes called the oldest living religion, is, as Jung says of consciousness itself, quote, a story with no beginning, end quote. In childhood, our memories do not simply start one day, but seem to emerge out of the murky waters of the unconscious. And this is how we must view the origins of Hinduism as a religion. The further into the past we look, the less clear the picture becomes until history is indistinguishable from religion, myth, legend, and fantasy. This is not to say that Hinduism does not have a history. Like all living religions, there are distinct phases of Hinduism that religious historians have identified as key to understanding its progression over the millennia from prehistory into the modern day. And it is vital that we keep this progression in mind. Though we should always be sensitive when discussing religions in an academic and largely secular light, it is all the more crucial when it comes to Hinduism, a religion whose most ancient form is the cultural heritage of a people and whose modern form is a living belief system for millions. As this chapter continues, I will try to distinguish these two Hinduisms, the ancient and the modern, as clearly as possible. That said, I will not use repetitive qualifiers when mere context will do. This dissertation is, after all, a mythological endeavor for which Hinduism is more relevant as an ancient and influential mythology than as a modern belief system. For all of the reasons discussed above, there is little to no consensus for the first emergence of ancient Hinduism. Traditional periodization generally delineates a pre-Vedic phase from the 4th to early 2nd millennia BCE, at which point a number of Indus Valley civilizations may have begun to fuse. The so-called Vedic period which followed spanned over 1,000 years, ending in the 8th or 7th century BCE with the beginnings of a written tradition. With this in mind, it is important to acknowledge that although it is accurate to consider Hinduism as a particularly ancient religion, it did not truly begin to crystallize into a recognizable form until around the 6th century BCE, in close chronological proximity to similar developments in Judaism, Buddhism, Jainism, and even Greek and Roman systems. The Vedas eventually gave way to the Upanishads and other early texts, but Hinduism still did not come into its golden age until the recordings of the great Indian epics at some point between 200 BCE and 200 CE. Much like the epics of ancient Greece, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Indian epics serve as a cultural foundation of India by offering to the people of the area not only a mythic history, but also an image of what it means to be Indian. As Matavi Devi Vanamali puts it in her introduction to Hanuman, the devotion and power of the monkey god, quote, the great verse epics of our country, called the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are storehouses of wisdom, and by reading them our spiritual evolution will be hastened. Truth is a matter of direct realization by our own individual efforts, but the sages gave us many different methods to attain it. End quote. Again, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Indian epics are pseudo-anonymous works. Just as the historicity of Homer is forever in question, so too are the enigmatic authors of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, Vyasa and Valmiki, respectively, caught in the murky gray between history and mythology. But I am prepared to state that almost every individual among the 500 millions living in India is aware of the story of the Ramayana in some measure or another. Everyone of whatever age, outlook, education, or station in life knows the essential part of the epic and adores the main figures in it, Rama and Sita. R.K. Narayana. Of these two great Indian epics, only the Ramayana will feature heavily in this study. As we have said, the Ramayana is attributed to the semi-mythical poet Valmiki thought to have lived toward the end of the first millennium BCE, but the story itself is certain to have existed within the oral tradition long before then. In his introduction to William Buck's much celebrated retelling of the epic, B.A. Van Newton has this to say about the poet-author. Quote, few authors in world literature can lay claim to having inspired as many poets and dramatists, and to having transmitted moral and ethical values to as vast and receptive an audience in nations living thousands of miles apart and with radically different languages and cultures, as the obscure, almost legendary composer of the Sanskrit Ramayana, a poet known to us as Valmiki. At its most basic, Valmiki's Ramayana is the story of Lord Rama, the seventh avatar or earthly incarnation of the great Hindu god Vishnu. Born on earth to become the perfect king, but unaware of his divine lineage, Rama's devotion and resolve are first put to the test through a series of misfortunes. In order to protect his father's honor and follow his own dharma, or divine duty, Rama submits himself to 14 years of exile from his promised kingdom. But while living out his sentence as a forest hermit, Rama's resolve is again tested when his beloved wife is abducted by Ravana, the 10-headed demon king of Lanka. Much like the Greeks' long siege of Troy, the remainder of the Ramayana documents Rama's journey to Lanka and the bloody war he wages against the demons to reclaim his bride. The epic's title, Ramayana, is translated with a high level of consistency to Rama's Way. This title certainly has meaning on a number of different levels. By defeating the demon king, Rama clears the way to salvation. As imperfect beings, we can emulate the perfect man, Rama's way of living. But these more subtle explanations miss the vital importance of the most literal interpretation. The Ramayana tells the story of Rama's physical path, journey, or way through the wilderness to reclaim his bride, his other half, his self. It is in service to this mission that the divine monkey, Hanuman, Rama's foreshadow, is born on earth. The Hanumayya, Hanuman and the Ramayana. Look, I am sending my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way. The voice of one crying aloud in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make God's path straight. And in fulfillment of this, John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness. Mark chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. The passage above was used in chapter 3 to introduce John the Baptist as the study's first example of the foreshadow archetype. In his role as foreshadow, or forerunner of Christ, John was prophesied to prepare, quote, the way of the Lord, end quote, in a metaphorical sense. Later in this chapter, we will see just how literally Hanuman enacts this role for his Lord Rama, but at present it is more important to demonstrate that the two figures essentially have the same mission in life. Just as John the Baptist and Samuel prepare the people for their coming king, just as Moses and Merlin prepare the people for a coming symbol of the self, just as Samson and Elijah seek to reunite Yahweh with his wayward people, so too does Hanuman devote his every action to Lord Rama, preparing a causeway through the wilderness to reunite him with his beloved Sita. As Krishna Das says in his foreword to Hanuman, the devotion and power of the monkey god, quote, Sri Hanuman is the greatest of all devotees of the Lord. He is a Nandi, one of complete knowledge in the fullest sense of the word. He has merged with his Lord, Sri Rama, in his own being, and he sees his Lord in everything and everyone. Hanuman's love for Lord Rama runs to his very core. One particularly visceral story actually proves this to be literally true. When Rama's council questions Hanuman's devotion, he unhesitatingly rips open his own chest, quote, and to the astonishment of all, there was Rama enshrined within. End quote. But as deeply devoted as Hanuman is to Rama, he is, somewhat paradoxically, even more devoted to the Ramayana as a gospel. Years before the events of the Ramayana unfold, the infant monkey, Hanuman, listens with wonder to his bedtime story, the very same Ramayana he will later enact. Most versions of the epic begin not with the titular Rama, but with Hanuman. Like John the Baptist, who serves as the gateway into the New Testament, Hanuman is the gateway into the Ramayana. Quote, Lotus-eyed Sauti, who was that monkey Hanuman who met Bhima in the hills and who stayed in Arjuna's war flag while he fought. What is the story of Rama which keeps Hanuman alive so long as it is told by men on earth? End quote. Hanuman's very life force is inexorably tied to the Ramayana, not merely to Rama, but to Rama's way. This can also be seen at the very end of the narrative when, once again, Hanuman's devotion to Rama seems to eclipse even Rama himself. Quote, Still today, high in the pine forest lives Hanuman, said Sauti. He will always be listening wherever Rama's name is spoken. He will listen endlessly to his own old adventures and his own true stories. So take care. He is here. Now you know who Hanuman is. Then he saw Hanuman listening, a white monkey sitting there behind Sauti and smiling. As a reward for his unparalleled devotion to Rama, Hanuman is granted a unique form of immortality, so long as the Ramayana is told on earth. For this reason, there is a tradition that wherever the Ramayana is read or recited, quote, a seat is left vacant for Hanuman. As odd and unique as this tradition might seem, it is remarkably similar to a Jewish tradition discussed in chapter 4. Quote, Jews still expect the Messiah, and in their synagogues they keep a chair of Elijah, the prophet who is to come and announce the Messiah. They place newly circumcised male babies into the chair in hopes that Elijah will announce this child as the Messiah. For Christians, this Elijah has come, and he is the preacher and prophet, John the Baptist. End quote. It would be easy to overlook the similarities between these two traditions as sheer coincidence, but it is not the detail of the empty chair that gives this connection substance, so much as the similar role that all three foreshadow figures play. Elijah's role as foreshadow of the Messiah is so important that his spirit lives on eternally to fulfill his mission. For Christians, Elijah's spirit is reincarnated as John the Baptist in order to announce the arrival of Christ. In the Hindu system, Rama is, in a sense, reincarnated anywhere at any time that the Ramayana is told. As such, Hanuman must also manifest to serve his master. As the axiom goes, quote, where Rama's story is, there is Hanuman. End quote. The conception and birth of Hanuman. Quote, You are going to conceive and bear a son. Let no razor touch his head, for the boy is to be a Nazarite to God from the womb on. He shall be the first to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Judges chapter 13, verse 5. And Anjana, you should not eat anything until you have been bathed and said your prayers. You have come to this forest with a purpose. In order to fulfill this, you should live the life of an anchorite. Do tapasya to Lord Shiva and Parvati to give you a wondrous son and deliver you from your curse. From Hanuman, the devotion and power of the monkey god. Though Hanuman is inexorably linked to the Ramayana, we must reach outside of the epic to the peripheral texts and folktales that surround it in order to learn about the character's origins. In this pursuit, I primarily draw from two character studies of Hanuman. I have already introduced Vanamali's hagiography, Hanuman, the devotion and power of the monkey god. Apart from some valuable insights in chapter introductions, Vanamali's work is no frills collection of folk tales which I use more or less as a primary source anthology. To complement this work, I also pull heavily from Hanuman's tale, The Messages of a Divine Monkey, by Philip Ludendorff. Ludendorff adds a few more of his own insights than does Vanamali, but in truth, the two works have a high degree of overlap when it comes to the folk tales they include. In a positive light, the parity between the collections confirms that though the extant canon of Hanuman's lore is extensive, it is nevertheless manageable. Like the other foreshadow figures we have explored, the details of Hanuman's semi-miraculous conception and birth are fantastical and quite convoluted. To be sure, one would expect the circumstances surrounding the origins of a divine, super-strong monkey to be unusual, but with Hanuman there is the added complication of competing myths pointing to different fathers, each of which has multiple variations. Many of these variations are inconsequential, at least for the study at hand, but the competing paternity claims must be addressed. The wide array of origin myths for Hanuman can largely be separated into three categories based on three different fathers. Kesari, the monkey chief, Vayu, the god of the wind, and Shiva, the most chthonic and foreboding presence in the Trimurti, or Hindu trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. It is rather perplexing that both Vanamali and Ludendorff assume that these differing stories must be mutually exclusive, and choose to frame them as a de facto paternity dispute. In my mind, the myths actually fit nicely together, just as John the Baptist might be said to have had an earthly father in Zechariah, a messenger father in the angel Gabriel, and a sort of reincarnate father in Elijah the prophet. So too might Hanuman's complex parentage be best understood if we view Kesari as his earthly father, Vayu as his messenger father, and Shiva as his reincarnate father. Using the line of thinking above, a single composite conception story for Hanuman naturally emerges. When Ravana the demon king conquers heaven and earth, Lord Vishnu, the maintainer, decides that he must soon be born on earth as his seventh avatar, Rama, to save the world. But Vishnu sees that he will need the help of Shiva, the destroyer, his equal and opposite. It is only together that these two great gods, the light and the shadow, form the totality of the archetype of the self. As we have seen, the foreshadow always manifests before the transcendent ego figure. And so it is interesting to note that Shiva anticipates Vishnu's request. Quote, Shiva appeared and informed him that he has already given the monkey woman Anjana the boon that he will be born as her son. Now he adds that his son will be Vishnu's helper in the war with Ravana. In one popular version, Shiva decides to be born as a monkey for reasons which align perfectly with the ascetic tendencies that we have seen time and time again in the foreshadow archetype. Quote, Parvati, Rama is very dear to me and I am going to incarnate myself on earth in order to serve him. Parvati protested at this, but Shiva said that he would send only his amsa, or part of himself. Shiva decided to take the form of a monkey since it is humble with simple needs and a simple lifestyle and needed no observance of the rules of caste and stages of life. This would give him maximum scope for service. This is the mission of the foreshadow in action, to, quote, incarnate on earth in order to serve the self. Or, as it is said of both Elijah and John the Baptist, quote, behold, I am sending my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way. End quote. In all the many variant origin stories for Hanuman, his mother, Anjana at least, is fairly consistent. Yet again, we have a devout but barren couple desperately desiring a son. Quote, a time came when Anjana started to feel unhappy at the thought that though she had spent so many years as a wife, she still had not become a mother. Kesari knew the cause of her unhappiness and told her that it was the best that they should undergo some penance in order to be blessed with a son. On an archetypal level, Anjana's inability to produce a child is just a matter of time. As always, the foreshadow must wait until just prior to the conception of the ego hero before finally manifesting. Like the incubus demon, that creature between the moon and the earth sent to Merlin's mother, or the angel Gabriel sent to Elizabeth, Shiva sends a messenger to carry his seed to Anjana. When Vayu, the wind god, quote, gently stole away her clothes and embraced her, end quote, it is hard to miss the undertones of rape which show so clearly in the miraculous conception of Merlin the magician. Quote, who had no human, as they say, for a sire, an incubus of the air that urged its embraces on an enclosed vestal vowed to virginity, a Christian nun clandestinely in the night. Connecting Hanuman to Merlin in this way also serves as an important reminder of the foreshadow's unique ability to take shadow energy, subvert it, and use it in the service to the light. As we saw in chapter 5, Merlin is the product of a Faustian competition between Christ and the devil. But instead of succumbing to the Christian fanaticism of the medieval period, Merlin somehow survives by embracing his shadow lineage. Quote, the devil gave me the ability to know all things said and done in the past, and that is how I know what life your mother has always led. Our Lord, moreover, wanted me to have that memory because of my mother's virtue and her true repentance, and because of my own submission to the commandments of the Holy Church, he granted me the power to know the things to come. End quote. This, at last, helps to explain why seemingly competing myths about Hanuman's three different fathers emerged in the first place, and perhaps more importantly, why they have survived in the Hanuman lore to the present day. Just as Merlin inherits his more upstanding proclivities from his association with Christianity and his more chthonic, but nevertheless vital ones from the shadow world of the devil, each of Hanuman's father figures grants to him different extraordinary abilities that will be of some import when the events of the Ramayana unfold. As we will see later on, Hanuman's claim as a son or incarnation of Shiva explains his unparalleled capacity for self-renunciation, meditation, and his eternal devotion to Rama. His claim as a son of the wind god Vayu explains why, just as John is born with, quote, spirit and power of Elijah, end quote, Hanuman is born with Vayu's own, quote, swiftness and power, end quote, to carry mountains, grow and shrink to any size, or to jump over oceans. Hanuman's claim as the son of Kesari, the monkey chief, may have survived for no other reason than to explain his appearance as a monkey. But another explanation for his simian form is from a popular tale in which his mother, Anjana, mocks Lord Indra's 1,000 eyes and is cursed to be born on earth with a monkey face. As a reward for her devotion to him, Shiva later grants her a way out. Quote, the moment Hanuman is born, you will regain your former body and be able to return to these heavenly regions. Both the cruel curse and later cure here are reminiscent of John's father, Zechariah, who mocks the angel Gabriel at the thought of Elizabeth becoming pregnant at her old age. Zechariah is stricken dumb until the moment of John's birth, quote, when immediately Zechariah recovered his voice and the use of his tongue and began to bless God, end quote. Like the famous locks of Samson, which no razor can ever touch, or Merlin, who frightens the midwives when he comes out, quote, all covered in hair with more than any child they had ever seen, Hanuman, quote, does not come into the world naked like an ordinary infant. He is tawny-colored, furry-bodied, and adorned with supernatural ornaments, which include a tight red loincloth, a sacred thread of twisted manja grass, and a pair of heavy gold earrings, such as yogis wear. Though there are certainly cultural differences in terms of particular details, Hanuman's simple attire, which relates to his being raised as an anchorite, also shows notable resemblance to the Nazarite vow that we have already associated with a number of foreshadow figures. Quote, John the Baptist was set apart as a Nazarite for life obligation. He was forbidden to drink wine, to cut the hair of his head, and to approach a dead body. There were only three such Nazarites for life: Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. They dressed like old prophets in garments of camel's hairs attached to the body by a leather girdle. They ate only food of the desert. Merlin seems to have been a fourth Nazarite, which would perhaps explain his hirsute appearance that struck everyone so memorably. Connections of this sort, stated so directly, need little explanation. From Esau to Mephistopheles, from Stevenson's Mr. Hyde to Hesse's Steppenwolf, the shadow archetype has always had a symbolic association with wild body hair that is quite uncanny in its consistency, and as Goodrich's research above demonstrates, the foreshadow archetype has not shed this association. One of the central assertions of this chapter is that Hanuman's role as a foreshadow figure plays itself out in particularly flamboyant fashion, and so it is no great surprise that his association to body hair is more blatant than John's camel skin garments, remains longer than Merlin's thick lanago, and is, as we will be shown later on, more in line with Samson's magical locks. But Hanuman is not simply a hairy man. He is a monkey. This may largely be a byproduct of Eastern aesthetic. Quote, the Hindu mind had no difficulty in picturing the supreme in the form of either animal or human. Thus we find Ganesha depicted as a human being with the head of an elephant, and Hanuman, who was a monkey. End quote. But though Vanamali's argument above helps to explain why Hanuman is an animal, she fails to address the more important questions. Why is Hanuman specifically a monkey? Ludendorff takes an approach that is more thorough, more depth psychological, and ultimately more satisfying. Instances of human veneration of simians are, in fact, comparatively rare in the historical record, and even where they are found, they usually represent but one of a more ambivalent and frequently more negative response. If animals in general are, in Claude Levi-Strauss's famous dictum, good to think with, I would add that different kinds of animals seem to inspire different thoughts. If the nobility of the lion and the virility and wind-like swiftness of horses have been widely admired, anthropoid primates have typically evoked responses that focus on their similarity to and difference from their human observers. Ludendorff poignantly finishes off his argument with a famous aphorism from the Roman poet Aeneas. Quote, the ape, that vile beast so similar to us. End quote. When Aeneas says of the ape is the very definition of the shadow archetype. We hate our shadow precisely because we see ourselves in it. And so Hanuman is a monkey because he is a shadow figure. That the ego hero, Rama, could learn to love this vile beast is what makes Rama a symbol of the self. That a shadow figure could become the most beloved friend of Lord Rama, the friend of the bridegroom, is what elevates Hanuman as a foreshadow. The birth of Lord Rama. The perfect man takes a false step, apparently commits a moral slip, and we ordinary mortals stand puzzled before the incident. It may be less an actual error of commission on his part than a lack of understanding on ours. Measured in eternity, such an event might stand out differently. But until we attain that breadth of view, we are likely to feel disturbed and question the action. Rama was an ideal man, all his faculties in control in any circumstance, one possessed of an unwavering sense of justice and fair play. R.K. Narayan, The Ramayana, page 97. After the extraordinary events of his conception and birth, the foreshadow often goes into a unique form of archetypal stasis, a de facto hibernation, which makes it all the more impactful when he suddenly bursts, quote, out of the desert like an apparition, a wild man clothed in camel hair, a leather belt tied around his waist, feeding on locusts and wild honey. In some traditions, this mysterious gap in the narrative is simply too tempting to be let be, and is soon filled with a colorful folk tale which offer glimpses of superhuman powers that the foreshadow will only later master. In one such tale, the infant Hanuman mistakes the sun itself for a delicious mango and leaps in excitement to eat it. The gods have to bend heaven and earth in order to stop the precocious monkey. Because of this outbursts like this, the foreshadow often needs this grace period to educate himself and learn to control his powers, both physical and mental. Other folk tales seek to explain how the foreshadow knows so precisely when the ego hero, destined to be the self, has made it through his own childhood and is ready to begin his journey of transcendence. In the case of Merlin the magician, this is explained quite simply by the fact that he is a powerful seer. From his reclusive home in the woods, Merlin watches Arthur's slow but inexorable pathway toward the sword and the stone, the crown, and Camelot. But Hanuman is also given a proverbial window through which he can watch the distant childhood of his future lord, Rama. Quote, at bedtime in the forest, Mother Anjana tells little Hanuman inspiring stories of gods and heroes of the past. Among these stories is of Rama, the Ramayana. As the days pass, Hanuman becomes absorbed in the story, and when his mother gets to the point at which Rama meets Hanuman, her son asks in surprise who this character might be. His mother then explains to him that time is like a wheel encompassing a cycle of 4 ages that recur endlessly. The Rama story cheat is telling him is from a previous cycle, and the Hanuman of the story was once a monkey child like himself. In this way, Hanuman, like Merlin, can see into the murky haze of his own future. Though his one desire is to begin his earthly mission and travel to see his Lord at once, his mother encourages him to have patience. You will go to Rama when the time is right. End quote. The very same unbridled passion which drove a hungry monkey to leap into the skies after the solar disk also drives him to leap with 2 feet into his life's mission. It is, in a sense, the same passion which so often causes the foreshadow to be born premature, for the unborn John the Baptist to, quote, leap with delight, end quote, within his mother's womb when Mary arrives shortly after the Annunciation. While Hanuman eagerly awaits the beginning of his mission, Rama grows up as the beloved prince and presumptive heir to the throne of Ayodhya. In his physical beauty and mental faculties, Rama is, quote, the Maryada Purusha, or the perfect human being, end quote. But as Vanamali aptly says, it is actually through his exemplary adherence to the cosmic Dharma that he shows himself to be Vishnu incarnate. In a classic folk motif, Rama's father, the king, promises to offer whatever his youngest wife desires. She asks for Rama to be exiled for 14 years so that her own son, Bharata, might become king in his place. The king, of course, wants to back away from his promise, but Rama forbids him from doing so. Quote, for every broken promise breaks away a little Dharma, and every break of Dharma brings closer the day the worlds too must break apart. When Dharma is altogether gone, the 3 worlds will end. They will be destroyed once more. If man breaks his word, why should the stars above keep their promise not to fall? Self-exile, Rama in the wasteland. Quote, as I crossed back through Kasala, I saw that in all your kingdom the trees let fall their leaves and have no flowers, no scented fruit, no new buds. In your land the ponds are desolate, the streams are dry, the wells are bitter and silted. Groves wither, no creature moves or speaks, beasts of prey will not wander. The empty woods are stricken dumb, they have no nobility. They stand in gloom on all sides. Food has no flavor, and no one wants to eat it anyway. Stones are burnt black, grass is faded and dead, crops and water plants perish, fish and gardens die. I drove the cheerless, dreary road, my lord. The passage above from Buck's retelling of the epic should be quite familiar by now as a description of the archetypal wasteland. When the Ark of the Covenant is lost, when the throne is empty, when the Grail Knight fails his quest, when, as Eliot says, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, in short, when the mandala of the self loses itself, the wasteland naturally emerges. As an ego hero, Rama demonstrates his high potential for transcendence by facing his exile head on. Although his views the whole scenario as disastrous, he upholds his father's honor and fulfills his dharma by leaving his kingdom on his own terms. Rama does not wish for the world to become a wasteland in his absence, and sincerely believes that his brother Prince Bharata will make a wonderful king. But as Bharata himself knows, he is not an adequate stand-in for the symbol of the self. Quote, Rama, you are the true king. I will go back. I will rule Kasala in trust for you for 14 years, and your sandals will be on the throne. These 14 years of exile in which Rama's sandals sit upon the throne of Kosala establish him as a sort of dying and rising god, a Christ figure, a once and future king. For Bharata is, as Stewart says of King Uther, quote, but a regent for whom went before him and who comes after him, the past and future king. Neither does Bharata fit the archetypal role of Foreshadow, at least not nearly as well as Hanuman. Still, it is worth noting that his meaningful gesture here, placing Rama's sandals on the throne, is nevertheless a beautiful image for the foreshadow's natural humility and egoless devotion to the self. More specifically, the image brings to mind a number of other foreshadow figures. John the Baptist says, there comes one after me who is mightier than I, whose sandal straps I am not worthy to stoop down and loose. Moses is told to humble himself before the burning bush, quote, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground, end quote. And as we will see shortly, the very first thing that Hanuman does when he meets his Lord is to throw, quote, himself at the feet of Rama, end quote, in an act of humble devotion. If Rama's exile transforms the kingdom into a wasteland, it is nothing compared to the existential desolation that occurs when Rama's beloved bride Sita is kidnapped. Just as Demeter abandons the world to eternal winters when Hades abducts her daughter Persephone, so too does the earth itself rebel when the 10-headed demon king Ravana steals Sita into her dark chariot. Quote, the loss of Sita outraged the worlds. Ravana flew over the earth. He passed over hills, and the hills saw him. They recited charms aloud with the sound of their falling waters. They uplifted their waving arms of green trees. In anger they yawned, opening their valleys to the skies. Lakes looked up and whirled their waters. White open lilies wore their fearful eyes, and watery foam and mists their robes thrown off in grief. The waterfalls wept. Buck, Ramayana, page 174. It is at this lowest point when the wasteland without matches the wasteland within Rama himself, and Rama is most in need of a friend that Hanuman, the foreshadow, is first introduced to the narrative. The foreshadow of Rama, Hanuman, and the search for Sita. Quote, at the very first sight of Rama, he was filled with an ecstasy, the reason for which he was unable to say. He felt as if he were seeing God. It seems almost to be an archetypal law that the ego immediately recognizes its shadow. This recognition is not always fully conscious, and, of course, the ego's resulting actions toward this shadow are rarely positive. In Chapter 3, I introduced a dual axes model of individuation, a visual depiction of how the ego's relationship with its shadow directly relates to its own journey of individuation, or said another way, shadow integration begets individuation. With this in mind, a lot can be determined about an ego hero's trajectory and potential for transcendence based solely on his or her first response to a confrontation with the shadow. Hence, Jacob's combative but ultimately reconciliatory response to Esau suggests a higher potential for individuation than does Cain's murderous response to Abel. And as we have seen, it is the rare ego indeed who, like Jesus meeting John at the river's edge, instantly recognizes and embraces the foreshadow. However rare, this is precisely how Rama and Hanuman first meeting transpires. Desperately following the fading tracks of Ravana's flying chariot in search of Sita, Rama and his devoted brother Lakshmana approach a particularly dark bend in the woods. Out of the shadows steps a poor woodcutter. Quote, "Are you truly gods walking on foot through the woods? Oh, you two, you look at me like lions, my boys." Rama smiled. He looked around the hill as though he had stepped fresh from the world's beginning to look around and see what it had been done. He looked at the woodcutter. "Oh, Hanuman of golden earrings. Rama, I remember you now." Hanuman shook himself. There he was, white with glossy fur, a long tail curved gracefully, long thin arms, feet like hands. Within the narrative, this instant recognition and quote, unaccountable feeling of joy, end quote, between the foreshadow and the symbol of the self is explained away with an interesting detail of Hanuman's birth. Along with his thick fur and simple loincloth, Hanuman was also born with a pair of magical golden earrings, quote, that only the one who would be his master would be able to perceive. Hanuman's devotion to Rama is instant, unmeasurable, and endless. But when Rama next frees the forest from a tyrannical monkey king, he gains an entire army of devoted monkey and bear warriors. These warriors are split up into groups and sent in every direction to search for Sita, the center of Rama's mandala. Hanuman leads a group southward toward the island kingdom of Lanka because, of course, quote, that was the most important of the assignments. The foreshadow's manifestation at the water's edge. Quote, "Who will leap the ocean and bring back news of Sita?" End quote. After a long and difficult search for Rama's queen, Hanuman and his group finally learn that Sita is being held captive by Ravana in the magical demon city of Lanka across the sea. Up to this point in the journey, Hanuman suffers from a partial form of amnesia that is usual to the foreshadow. Where the ego hero is still entirely ignorant of his divine birth, the foreshadow sees both his past and future, but like Merlin's visions, they are often murky and mysterious beyond recognition. This all changes in one critical moment of self-realization and manifestation, which most often takes place at the edge of a seemingly uncrossable body of water. This moment of manifestation is perhaps most clearly seen in the foreshadow figure of Moses. Up until he channels the power of Yahweh to miraculously part the Red Sea, Moses is an insecure and weak man who constantly doubts his own ability to lead. But from the moment that the Israelites follow him on dry land, Moses is transformed. The same might be said of Stuart's Merlin, who, before he masters his powers to magically transport the standing stones across the sea from Ireland, is never sure whether his actions are, quote, human instinct or God's shadow, end quote. Even John the Baptist has a moment of self-realization at the water's edge. Before Jesus' arrival at the Jordan, John seems only to know that someone at some point is coming. But even as Jesus is walking down the river, John confidently announces, quote, "This is the one of whom I said, The one coming after me now is ahead of me because he was before me. End quote. In most tellings of the Ramayana, Hanuman's failure to see his true power is the result of a childhood curse. But with a simple reminder, the full archetypal power of the foreshadow floods into Hanuman. Quote, remember that you can grow to any stature you wish, and if you so decide, you can cover the entire world in one stride, outdoing even Vishnu in the days of the Mahabali. Make yourself as immense as you need, and you can have one foot on this shore and another across the sea on the other shore. That is Lanka. Other than perhaps Samson, powers that fantastical would seem beyond the foreshadows figures we have explored, and yet Ginsberg describes Elijah in much the same way. Quote, with 4 strokes of his wings, Elijah can traverse the world. Hence, no spot on earth is too far removed for his help. As an angel, he enjoys the power of assuming the most various appearances to accomplish his purposes. End quote. What is more, Al-Qadir, the Islamic folk figure and focal character study of the conclusion chapter, receives similar legends. Quote, I saw someone coming toward me on the surface of the water. He saluted me and went off, making for a lighthouse on top of a hill over 2 miles distant from us. This distance he covered in 2 or 3 steps. As he flies over the sea, Hanuman has a battle with a demon named Simika, who has the power to steal the shadow of anything she catches. This battle is, of course, intriguing depth psychologically because of its implications in a study which theorizes a foreshadow archetype, the shadow that transcends its own often sinister role. Quote, Simhika swam to the surface and seized his shadow, and in the air Hanuman felt himself being dragged down and held back. Simhika stood on the water holding Hanuman's shadow in her claws and looking at him with tiny red eyes. She opened her ugly mouth and bared her yellow scaly teeth and started to pull at his shadow. Watch out, said Hanuman. Beware, I am on Rama's service, and his kingdom is all the world. End quote. In the end, it is only by focusing on his devotion to Rama and the affection he receives in return that the foreshadow can defeat the shadow monster and continue on his mission. Sita and the confrontation at court. Quote, Hanuman shook himself and diminished his size till he was no bigger than a hand, and fled up the Sinsapa tree to a higher branch. There, like a hidden bird, he watched from far within the dark shadows of the leaves. After his harrowing crossing of the sea, Hanuman faces a few more obstacles, including an encounter with the personification of the island of Lanka itself. But eventually, Hanuman finds his way to the protected garden where Ravana holds Sita imprisoned. Despite Ravana's daily attempts to first seduce and later intimidate her into forsaking her wifely vows, Sita remains entirely faithful to Rama. And yet, Sita is just beginning to lose hope when Hanuman steps out of the shadows to speak to her. Quote, I have come as an envoy for your husband. He is alive and well and is waiting for me to tell him of your whereabouts. He grieves for you night and day and has sent me as his messenger. Hanuman, now fully conscious of his magical abilities, wants to immediately carry Sita on his shoulders to Rama, but Sita rightly refuses. Though the foreshadow announces the arrival and prepares the way, the path of individuation can only be walked by the ego hero. In order to cheer up Sita and incite a meeting with Ravana, Hanuman channels his full archetypal powers to lay waste to the city of Lanka. Allowing himself to be captured, Hanuman confronts the demon king in his own court, taking on a role that is both consistent and quite unique to the foreshadow archetype. Just as Moses confronts the Pharaoh for his unjust enslavement of Yahweh's people, just as Elijah confronts Ahab for the evils of his foreign bride Jezebel, just as John the Baptist confronts Herod for unlawfully taking his brother's wife, just as Merlin confronts King Vortigern for his tyrannical rule, so too does Hanuman confront the demon king for abducting Sita. Quote, I am the servant of Lord Rama, Prince of Ayodhya and Prince among men. I have come here to speak with you. You have abducted his beloved wife, and he has asked me to ascertain her whereabouts. I devastated your garden only so that I would be brought face to face with you. Listen to me and let Sita go and save yourself and your country. Sita spells death for you and your clan. As the narrative continues, this central call, let Sita go, is levied at Ravana over and over again, first by Hanuman, then by his advisors, and finally by his own brother. Despite their surface level differences, Hanuman's message is highly reminiscent of Moses' message from Yahweh, demanding that Pharaoh let my people go. And in both cases, the tyrant gets very close to giving up before his ego gets the best of him. Quote, sleep and forget her. Ravana rubbed his eyes. Yes, I am tired and spent. But then he shook his head, took a deep breath of night air and sighed. But I have lost myself in longing. End quote. The tyrannical ego's solution to the foreshadow problem is always the same. Cut off his head. End quote. In one version, Hanuman survives an actual beheading with a miraculously hardened neck, a miracle exactly paralleled in a Jewish folktale. Quote, Moses mounted the scaffold, and a sword sharp beyond compare was set upon his neck 10 times, but it always slipped away because his neck was as hard as ivory. Only John the Baptist is successfully decapitated, and Herod is literally haunted by his decapitation for the rest of his days. When execution does not work, Ravana moves to humiliate Hanuman instead. Believing Hanuman to be securely bound, the demons light his beautiful tail on fire. But Hanuman feels no pain and easily breaks free, using his flaming tail to spread the fire throughout Lanka. Like the 10 plagues unleashed on Egypt or the wrath of Elijah unleashed upon the prophets of Baal, Hanuman's timely escape from court is a disaster for the city. But the particular modus operandi of this destruction relates most closely to another foreshadow figure. Quote, Samson went and caught 300 foxes. He took torches and turning them tail to tail, he placed a torch between each pair of tails. He lit the torches and turned the foxes loose among the standing grain of the Philistines, setting fire to stacked grain, standing grain, vineyard, and olive trees. It is times like this that we can see past the foreshadow's transcendent devotion and witness once again the shadow trickster who so loves to humble the inflated ego. Indeed, this role is not below the foreshadow, so long as the actions are still in service to the archetype of the self. Preparing the way for Rama. A voice rings out clear in the desert, a road for the Lord. Level in the wilderness a highway for our God. Let every valley be raised, every hill and mountain made low. I see behind me now the last of crossways, and I see before me a straight and final highway to the end of all my divination. You are king. End quote. Hanuman carried Rama as advance parties made a roadway. They drained swamps and brought water to dry camps, leveled hills and filled hollows, broke boulders into gravel, and cut away brush. End quote. After single-handedly burning the city of Lanka, Hanuman finally travels back to inform Rama of Sita's whereabouts. And this is where his most literal enactment of the foreshadow mission begins. Isaiah's mysterious prophecy above is purely metaphorical. For Christians, it heralds the return of the foreshadow, Elijah the prophet reborn as John the Baptist, to figuratively, quote, level in the wilderness a highway for the coming Messiah. John prepares the people for their own salvation by raising, quote, every valley, the poor common folk humbled by their circumstances. He levels every hill and mountain, the corrupt, sycophantic religious leaders of the day. But Hanuman's role as a foreshadow figure is hardly so subtle. With an army of monkeys at his side, Hanuman literally prepares Rama's way, the Ramayana, southward through India to reunite him with his beloved. Quote, they drained swamps and brought water to dry camps, leveled hills and filled hollows, broke boulders into gravel and cut away brush. After 4 days of work, Hanuman and his crew have, quote, reduced all of southern India to a level plateau, and Rama reaches the sea. Though Hanuman himself has already leapt over the sea to Lanka, he now must find a way to help his lord Rama and an army of monkeys and bears to cross. In all archetypally profound moment, Hanuman uses the limitless power of the self to miraculous effect. Quote, Hanuman quickly thought of the brilliant idea of writing the Sanskrit word Ra and Ma on alternate stones and allowing the crack between them to stand for the long vowel Ah. The potency of Rama's name as a mantra causes the stones to float to the surface of the water, eventually creating a massive floating land bridge upon which Rama's army walks all the way to Lanka. The epic conclusion. Without Hanuman, Rama would have been helpless. It was Hanuman who found Sita, built the bridge to Lanka, and helped Rama to fight and kill Ravana. However, he never claimed any honor for himself and always remained in Rama's shadow. As is often the case, Hanuman's role as foreshadow starts winding down just as the narrative climax approaches. Merlin knows that he shall, quote, see no grail, end quote. Moses dies on a mountaintop overlooking the promised land that he may not enter. John the Baptist seems to predict his own death on the very brink of Christ's apotheosis, saying, quote, he must increase, but I must decrease, end quote. This is not to say that Hanuman's role in the battle is inconsequential. At one crucial moment, he disarms Kumbhakarna, a monstrous demon brother of Ravana, thereby balancing the odds before Rama steps in to finish the job. Later, when nearly all of Rama's army and Rama himself are killed in battle, Hanuman is sent on a mission to get a magical healing herb from the Himalayas. As quickly as his father, the wind, Hanuman makes his way to the mountain's peak, but momentarily forgets what the particular herb looks like in what has become perhaps his most iconographically recognizable scene. Hanuman's extraordinary solution is to uproot the entire mountain and fly with it back to the battlefield. Once again, Hanuman's mythologically vibrant feats are beyond those of other foreshadow figures in this study, besides the superhuman judge Samson. Quote, the first evidence of Samson's gigantic strength he gave when he uprooted two great mountains and rubbed them against each other. Such feats he was able to perform as often as the Spirit of God was poured out over him. Whenever this happened, it was indicated by his hair. It began to move and emit a bell-like sound which could be heard far off. Besides, while the Spirit rested upon him, he was able with one stride to cover the distance equal to that between Zora and Eshtal. In their direct association with wild hare, in their ability to jump over and in a pinch lift up mountains, Samson and Hanuman outwardly exemplify the foreshadow's inner powers. But the foreshadow will never risk eclipsing the archetype of the self in its time of glory, despite the often clear ability to do so. As the ancient poem goes, quote, my heart, Lord, holds this conviction. Greater than Rama is Rama's servant. It is therefore Rama and Rama alone who faces and defeats Ravana, the demon king. Psychologization of the epic. Quote, O Rama, did you think that dark was bad? End quote. Immediately after Ravana's death, Rama receives a sealed message from his defeated foe. Quote, Dear Rama, Lord of the worlds, think and remember how you promised Indra to kill me forever. Nothing is forever except for yourself. Except dying at your hand, how else could I make you take me into your own self? Right down to his vocabulary, the Demon King displays a depth psychological understanding of his own role, which at once redeems his character and demonstrates that the Ramayana is far more than a traditional war epic. In just a few lines, Ravana reveals Rama's divinity to him and offers a de facto definition of Jungian individuation. The journey of the ego hero is to identify those ostracized parts of the whole in order to, quote, take them back into your own self, end quote. In a sense, Ravana's rhetorical question, O Rama, did you think that dark was bad? End quote, is the very question that this dissertation seeks to answer. Indeed, Jung's contention that, quote, the brighter the light, the blacker the shadow, end quote, is only problematic because of an accompanying assumption that blacker shadow is necessarily scarier and more sinister, an assumption which proves untenable in the presence of chthonic yet transcendent foreshadow figures like Merlin, John, Elijah, and Hanuman himself. In this chapter, I have focused on the ways in which Hinduism and its great epics are particularly mythological when set in contrast to the more interior and psychological contents of Buddhism. But the conclusion of the Ramayana is a good reminder of what could be called the central postulate of depth psychology, that these two disciplines, mythology and psychology, are engaged in the very same endeavor to better understand the human condition in both its collective and individual forms. It is really only in the West that this is a modern revelation. In both Hinduism and Buddhism, psychology is the effort to lift the mythological veil of Maya or illusion in order to, quote, see through to the deeper reality. And at this point in the epic, when Rama finally remembers his eternal divinity, mythology and psychology seem to fuse. Quote, together we can constitute the universe. We validate each other's existence and delight in each other's company. I am the Paramantam Man, soul of the universe, and Sita is the Jivatman, the embodied soul. Ravana is the ego that separates these two entities. What unites them is bhakti, or devotion. You, Hanuman, are the embodiment of bhakti, and hence this esoteric secret has been revealed to you. Rama's psychological insights are as compelling as they are sudden. As an embodiment of bhakti, or divine devotion, Hanuman's life mission is to reunite the Jivatman with the Paramatman, the individual soul with the Anima Mundi, or world soul. But though the vocabulary is new, we have seen this mission played out before. By reuniting Rama with his eternal bride, Hanuman ushers in a new golden age and fulfills the Foreshadow's archetypal mission to pave the way for the coming symbol of the self. After the Ramayana, quote, live long, O noble Hanuman. Wherever my story is told, wherever the name of Rama is mentioned, you will be there to hear it. This story will be told as long as the sun and the moon shine, as long as people remain on this earth, and as long as you are there to hear it. Even after the great battle of Lanka, the Ramayana is far from over. Rama rules with Sita by his side for thousands of years before he makes the heartbreaking and quite baffling decision to banish his queen. Centuries after her abduction by Ravana, the townspeople suddenly begin to question whether Sita remained loyal to Rama after all. Though it is difficult to accept on an emotional level, Rama's decision is nevertheless wise from a psychological perspective. When he explains that a, quote, king must be blameless, end quote, he is actually taking on the impossible mantle of the archetype of the self. Quote, consider what is a king. Kings cannot afford blame. Ill fame is evil to kings. They, above all men, must be beyond reproach. Sita's years in exile, the birth of Rama's twin sons there in the forest, and the final reunion of the family are all vital moments in the Ramayana. But in this dissertation about the foreshadow archetype, and in this chapter about Hanuman, these events are nevertheless out of scope. In the end, Rama reascends to heaven and offers Hanuman a form of semi-immortality that is unique to the foreshadow. Like Merlin calling out from his mysterious esplumior, his crystal coffin, Hanuman returns to his reclusive home in the forest of the Himalayas. Quote, he witnessed the unending transformations of matter, birth and death, joy and sorrow, in aspiration and frustration, union and separation. There on that mountain, like Moses penning the Ten Commandments at the peak of Mount Sinai, Hanuman records the first ever Ramayana on, quote, sparkling crystalline slabs and with his diamond-like nails. When Valmiki the poet arrives and reads Hanuman's version, he is crestfallen at its perfection. In a final display of the foreshadow's complete egolessness, Hanuman casually throws, quote, his own version into the sea, where they raised huge waves before disappearing into the depths of the sea. The Inward Journey, Siddhartha, Foreshadow of the Buddha. Suppose a man wandering in a forest wilderness found an ancient path, an ancient trail traveled by men of old, and he followed it up, and by doing so he discovered an ancient royal capital where men of old had lived, with parks and groves and lakes walled round and beautiful to see. So I too found the ancient path, the ancient trail traveled by the fully enlightened ones of old. And what was that ancient path, that ancient trail? It was this noble eightfold path. Bhikkhu Nanamali, The Life of the Buddha, page 27. The psychologizing that takes place at the conclusion of the Ramayana is a natural transition point from Hinduism to Buddhism. This chapter has argued that when compared to the vibrant and mythological narratives of Hinduism, the more grounded contents of Buddhism could as easily be seen as a psychology as it could a belief system. But in the introduction to his biography, The Life of the Buddha, Bhikkhu Nanamali warns against this sort of oversimplification. Quote, there have been and are numerous and various attempts made to prove that Buddhism teaches annihilation or eternal existence, and that it is negativist, positivist, atheist, theist, or inconsistent, that it is a reformed Vedanta, a humanism, pessimism, absolutism, pluralism, monism, that it is a philosophy, a religion, an ethical system, or indeed almost what you will. End quote. If Buddhism has been reduced to all these various and often contradictory descriptors, it is surely a testament to the great depth and wide applicability of its teachings. But Nanamali is right. While stressing the psychological value of Buddhism, it is important to keep in mind that Buddhism is, first and foremost, an ancient and modern world religion. As we will see, the story of Siddhartha Gautama subverts the typical Indian epic, pulling the mythical projections back and internalizing them. In place of Rama, the blue-skinned demigod, there is Siddhartha, a capable yet fully human prince. Instead of embarking on an outward quest to save Sita from the 10-headed Ravana, Siddhartha takes an inward path to gain mastery over craving, boredom, and lechery on his way to attaining enlightenment. Rama's journey ends with his triumphant return to the throne, but the Buddha never truly returns and instead transforms the world around him with a new spiritual path. Every facet of Siddhartha's hero journey is internalized, and this includes his foreshadow figure, where Hanuman, John the Baptist, Merlin, and the Old Testament prophets are each split off from the ego consciousness of their respective narratives. The foreshadow and the self coexist within the personage of Siddhartha Gautama. It is only by means of his egoless rejection of his princely life and his phase of extreme asceticism in the wilderness that Siddhartha prepares a highway for the imminent arrival of the self, the birth of the Buddha within. Foreshadow of the self, the birth and childhood of Siddhartha. Quote, Prana is born of the self. Like a man and his shadow, the self and prana are inseparable. Prana enters the body at birth, that the desires of the mind continuing from past lives may be fulfilled. Swami Prabhavananda and Frederick Manchester, The Upanishads, Breath of the Eternal. In Chapter 4, we saw how quasi-foreshadow figures who prepare the way for the archetype of the self in symbolic rather than embodied form, often take on some of the archetypal qualities of the absent ego hero. This is particularly true of Moses. As the only point of view character, it is though the narrative itself projects hero qualities and motifs onto him. This phenomenon can also be seen in the personage of Siddhartha Gautama, the future Buddha. Because he is both shadow and ego, the foreshadow destined to become the self, the details which surround his prophesied birth form a complex and even paradoxical constellation of archetypal motifs. Like so many divine and semi-divine heroes of old, the birth of the future Buddha is announced to the queen through a series of deeply symbolic dreams, including the arrival of a, quote, magnificent white elephant, end quote. But when the king's holy men are summoned to interpret the dream, another familiar motif, the royal couple learns that their son's destiny is fragmented. Quote, Your Majesty, the Queen will give birth to a son who will be a great leader. He is destined to become either a mighty emperor who rules throughout the four directions, or a great teacher who will show the way of truth to all beings in heaven and earth. To make sense of this enigmatic dual prophecy, we must trace the archetypes of the self and the foreshadow back to their origin. Like Romulus and Remus, Cain and Abel, or Jacob and Esau, the primordial ego and the shadow are doomed to struggle, quote, against each other as hostile brothers, yet they are at the same time twins, inseparably connected and forming one being. End quote. Psychologically speaking, the queen is pregnant with twins, just as, quote, two nations are in Rebecca's womb, end quote, and two souls, alas, dwell in Faust's breast. The queen holds two destinies in her womb, but while Jacob fights Esau for supremacy, even in utero, the self and the foreshadow are locked in so warm an embrace that they become inseparable and even indistinguishable. Before coming to term, the queen purifies her body in a manner which is strikingly similar to the Nazarite vow, followed by Samson, Samuel, John the Baptist, Merlin, and with only minor deviation, Hanuman, by refraining, quote, from killing living beings, from taking what is not given, from unchastity, from false speech, and from indulgence in wine, liquor, and fermented brews. Additionally, Siddhartha shows an extreme precociousness which is usual to the foreshadow archetype, causing his mother to deliver him prematurely, and surprising those present at his birth with an instant ability to walk and talk. Quote, as soon as the Bodhisattva was born, he stood firmly with his feet on the ground. Then he took 7 steps to the north, and, with a white sunshade held over him, he surveyed each quarter. He uttered the words of the leader of the herd, quote, I am the highest in the world. I am the best in the world. I am the foremost in the world. This is the last birth. Now there is no more renewal of being in future lives. End quote. Though the divine authority and mandalic symmetry of this scene are certainly emblematic of an embodiment of the self, it is important to note that this sort of miraculous precociousness is not often seen in instances of the divine human hero, whose human elements must first be shed before apotheosis is possible. The motif is therefore an interesting synthesis of archetypal contents from the foreshadow and the self. As Prince Siddhartha grows up, his father shields him from the sorrows of the world in a desperate attempt to keep him as his royal heir and away from his more divine destiny. But just as Moses' life as a prince ends abruptly when he stumbles upon an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave, Siddhartha's eyes are opened when he witnesses the senseless death of a poor man and learns of the corrupt religious leaders who allowed it to happen. Self-exile, Siddhartha in the wasteland. While still young, a black-haired boy blessed with youth in the first phase of life, I shaved off my hair and beard, though my mother and father wished otherwise and grieved with tearful faces, and I put on the yellow robe and went forth from the house life into homelessness. Bhikkhu Nanamali, the life of the Buddha. When we consider again that John is prophesied to, quote, prepare the way of the Lord, end quote, or that Hanuman literally clears the way through India for his Lord in the Ramayana, or Rama's way, it is fitting that Siddhartha's chosen mission is to, quote, go and seek the way to enlightenment. But the life story of Siddhartha Gautama needs not be covered in the same depth as previous character studies. For one, Siddhartha is the sole point of view character, foreshadow and self in one, and so there is no longer two origin stories to cover. But beyond this, Siddhartha's arc follows fairly closely to that of the classic Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. However different they appear on the surface, all three begin with a beloved prince and heir who must go into exile. All three end with his triumphant return after many struggles. But though all three narratives begin with the hero's exile, the particular nature of their respective departures is significantly different. Arjuna and his brothers, the central heroes of the Mahabharata, are forced off of the throne after losing an ill-advised bet. Already seen, Lord Rama shows more agency by immediately accepting his own exile and facing it head-on despite his great disappointment. But Siddhartha's exile is entirely self-motivated. Far from being banished, it is Siddhartha himself who sees that the enlightened one cannot come into the world until he prepares a pathway through his own soul for the archetype of the self. Psychologically, Siddhartha's rejection of his sheltered and civilized life in the palace marks the beginning of his mission as a foreshadow figure in the wilderness. As such, it may initially seem incongruous that his very first act is to cut off his long flowing hair. Quote, then the future Buddha seized hold of his topknot and diadem and threw them into the air, saying, quote, if I am to become the Buddha, let them stay in the sky, but if not, let them fall to the ground. But though the foreshadow archetype has, time and time again, been associated with long hair, it is never this sort of embalmed and well-combed hair of palace life. As von Franz explains it, the comb is an image of ego consciousness attempting to arrange and confine the powers of the unconscious. It is therefore fitting that Siddhartha would himself choose to be, quote, shorn like Samson of his glory, end quote, thereby allowing his connection to the shadow realm of the collective unconscious to grow anew. The search for enlightenment, the search for the self. Quote, truly, nothing in the world has occupied my thoughts as much as the self, this riddle that I live, that I am one and am separated and different from everybody else, that I am Siddhartha, and about nothing in the world do I know less than about myself, about Siddhartha. Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha. Just as Hanuman and his army of monkeys and bears searched in every direction for Rama's lost bride, Siddhartha begins his foreshadow mission by traveling through all of India in search of ancient wisdom. In Old Path, White Clouds, walking in the footsteps of the Buddha, Thich Nhat Hanh describes Siddhartha's search for the, quote, ancient masters in almost mythical terms, saying that he tirelessly, quote, sought out each of them, no matter how many mountains and valleys he had to cross, end quote. But after quickly mastering everything that these teachers could offer him, Siddhartha begins to see that his search for enlightenment must not be an outward journey like the heroes of old. Because his goal is an interior one, so too must his journey venture inward, to search for the self within. Quote, he found a cave in which he could sit in meditation for long hours, and while sitting he practices he had done. On dark nights he entered the deepest and most wild reaches of the forest, the mere thought of which was enough to make a person's hair stand on end, and there he remained throughout the night. Like Hanuman carrying mountain peaks to the ground, or John the Baptist leveling every mountain and hill, Siddhartha submits himself to a life of extreme asceticism and self-mortification in order to gain mastery over even the strongest of human urges. Quote, suppose, with my teeth clenched and my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, I beat down, constrained, and crushed my mind with my mind. Suppose I practice the meditation that is without breathing. Suppose I entirely cut off food. End quote. But Siddhartha did not discover this path of extreme asceticism, and though difficult, it was not untraveled in his day. And so the future Buddha eventually concludes that excessively emaciating and tormenting the body does not help, and even hinders enlightenment. In this moment, Siddhartha accepts that he will have to pave his own pathway through which enlightenment might flow. Quote, where was this self, this innermost? It was not flesh and bone, it was not thought or consciousness, it was what the wise men taught. Where, then, was it? To press towards the self, towards Atman, was there another way that was worth seeking? Nobody showed me the way, nobody knew it, neither his father nor the holy songs, has Siddhartha. Having traversed both the mountains of bodily excess, his sheltered life in the palace, and the valleys of bodily neglect, his life of extreme asceticism in the wilderness, Siddhartha finally discovered a middle path, a mean between the extremes, a new way to enlightenment. The Great Awakening, the birth of the Buddha. Gautama was seized with a deep feeling that he would attain the Great Awakening that very night. Only the previous night he had had several unusual dreams. In one he saw himself lying on his side, his knees brushing against the Himalayas, his left hand touching the shores of the eastern sea, his right hand touching the shores of the western sea, and his 2 feet resting against the shores of the southern sea. In another dream, a great lotus as large as a carriage wheel grew from his navel and floated up to touch the highest clouds. In a third dream, birds of all colors, too many to count, flew toward him from all directions. These dreams seemed to announce that his great awakening was at hand. Thich Nhat Hanh, Old Path, White Clouds. Thus far, this chapter has taken for granted that the fully enlightened Buddha is an instance of what Jung calls a symbol of the self. Jung says as much in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Quote, a new side of Buddhism was revealed to me. I grasped the life of the Buddha as the reality of the self which had broken through and laid claim to a personal life. For Buddha, the self stands above all gods, a unus mundus, which represents the essence of human existence and of the world as a whole. In Shadow and Evil and Fairy Tale, von Franz goes even further, calling the Buddha the symbol of the self in the Buddhist civilization. Within this With this in mind, it is no great surprise that many of the signs which traditionally accompany the birth of the divine hero, the birth of the self, also present themselves on the eve of the Buddha's awakening. In addition to the prophetic and mandalic dreams seen above, tradition also holds that a, quote, star appeared in the sky, end quote, along with other celestial events, including torrential rain, thunder, lightning, and black clouds concealing the moon and stars. Like the to himself at the world tree, for Siddhartha sits beneath the Bodhi tree for days on end. In Hero with a Thousand Faces, Campbell illustrates how Siddhartha becomes, at this moment, the axis mundi, or the center of the world. Quote, the tree of life, i.e. the universe itself, grows from this point. The figure may be that of the cosmic man or woman seated or standing in a spot, or even fixed to the tree, for the hero, as the incarnation of God, is himself the navel of the world, the umbilical point through which the energies of eternity break into time. Thus the world navel is the symbol of the continuous creation. Quite rightly, Campbell associates this axis mundi motif with the image of Christ upon his cross, which for Christians opens the gate to eternal life. But for the purpose of this dissertation, the Buddha's great awakening beneath the Bodhi tree has an even richer association with Christ's baptism at the river Jordan. To be baptized is, after all, to be born in the Spirit. For Jesus, it is the birth of his divine ministry in the world. For the Buddha, it is birth itself. And there, with them at the world's navel, is the foreshadow archetype, John and Siddhartha, wild ascetics who serve as midwife to a new dispensation, the symbol of the self that will transform the cosmos. Siddhartha's internal transformation under the Bodhi tree is reflected outwardly in a number of visible ways. In Nathan's version of the tale, the first children to see him after his great awakening recognize the change before he even says a word. Quote, teacher, you look so different today. It is like you were a star. You look like a lotus that's just blooming. Indeed, Siddhartha's aura is so markedly altered that the children can't even bear to call him by the name of Siddhartha any longer, instead referring to him for the first time as the Buddha, or the awakened one. Though they do not consciously understand it, the children instinctively know that a new being has been born, and the time of the foreshadow is now at an end, like the, quote, extinction of the pre-dawn star in the rays of the ascending sun. In a very real sense, the divine being who emerges from under the Bodhi tree is altogether different from Siddhartha, the emaciated ascetic who first sat down beneath its branches. One is new, a new and luminous soul, while the, quote, the other is, as Heath Stubbs says of Merlin, quote, of aspect more antique and more awful, uncouth and unkempt, the crowd crowned with oak leaves. But in a purely physical sense, the Buddha does nothing to visually distinguish himself from his foreshadow. He does not greatly alter his habits, he does not change his clothing, and he does not shave his head. Where, then, does the popular image of the bald and rotund laughing Buddha, or the widespread monastic practice of shaving the heads of initiates, originate? Because the aesthetic is clearly not based on historical accuracy, nor even on the narrative tradition, we are forced to conclude, as Zimmer does, that the removing of the hair is a symbolic act of, quote, renouncing the generative forms of the vegetable animal realm and revolting against the procreative principles of life, sex, earth, and nature to enter upon a spiritual path. Said another way, the Buddha is bald, or at least well groomed, because Siddhartha is hairy and unkempt. The Buddha is rotund and laughing, because the foreshadow is emaciated and stern. Conclusion: the foreshadow in Hesse's Siddhartha. In the shade of the house, in the sunshine of the river bank by the boats, in the shade of the shallow wood and the fig tree, Siddhartha, the handsome Brahman's son, grew up with his friend Govinda. The sun browned his slender shoulders on the river bank while bathing at the holy ablutions at the holy sacrifices. Shadows passed across his eyes in the mango grove during play, while his mother sang during his father's teachings. Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, page 3. In Chapter 2, Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse was placed alongside Goethe's Faust and Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as an introduction to Jung's shadow archetype and the larger tradition of shadow psychology which branched from it. These three texts were chosen because they all focus on the inner struggle between ego and shadow that rages in all individuating souls. The protagonists of these works were not the rare and transcendent beings which we have explored since. Like most ego heroes, they bottle up, flee from, and rage against their respective shadows. When treated in this manner, the shadow archetype always responds in kind, and so Mephistopheles, Mr. Hyde, and the Steppenwolf have little in common with the foreshadow figures of this dissertation. But Steppenwolf is not the only novel in which Hesse deals with this theme, what Stevenson calls, quote, the duality of man. In C.G. Jung and Hermann Hesse, A Record of Two Friendships, Miguel Serrano goes as far as to say that, quote, Hesse's books contain a leitmotif which is always the same, a sort of doppelganger motif in which two characters, quote, are the same person, end quote, representing opposite characteristics. But though Hesse's works all focus on the relationship between the ego and the shadow, that is not to say that these relationships are necessarily at the same level of development. With Siddhartha, for instance, the very name of Hesse's titular character serves as an instant cue to the reader that the protagonist is destined for a level of individuation which is far beyond that of Steppenwolf or Damien. And it is easy to see how these latter two novels add credence to Serrano's claim that Hesse's theme is, quote, always the same. But novels follow the rare trend both novels follow the rare trend of being named not after the ego hero, as is typical, but after the shadow figure. The mangy, quote, wolf from the steppes takes top bill over meek Harry Holler, just as demonic Max Damien eclipses Emile Sinclair in Damien. But as this chapter has shown, Siddhartha is also named after a shadow figure, or rather a foreshadow figure. His transcendent humility and devotion have until now led scholars off the proverbial scent. Yet his shadow presence cannot be ignored. To those even generally familiar with the Buddhist tradition, the most perplexing and intriguing aspect of Siddhartha is undoubtedly the way in which Hesse chooses to separate out the at least semi-historical figure of Prince Siddhartha Gautama from the spiritual leader, the Buddha. While following along with Siddhartha's coming of age, there would be little reason for even the most scrupulous reader to question that this protagonist is indeed the future Buddha. And yet, one day Siddhartha hears of another monk. Quote, someone had appeared called Gautama, the illustrious, the Buddha. He had conquered in himself the sorrows of the world and had brought to the standstill the cycle of rebirth. As the foreshadow always does, Siddhartha immediately recognizes the Buddha out of the crowd of hundreds of monks in identical attire. In almost all of his works, Hesse seeks to humanize the shadow archetype, and the same goes for the foreshadow. Siddhartha is extraordinarily skilled in the art of crushing the ego, but this does not truly come from a place of egolessness. With inner strength equal to the outer strength of Samson or Hanuman, he surpasses all of his peers, but finds himself no closer to attaining enlightenment. Siddhartha's lack of enlightenment becomes immediately clear in his first interactions with the Buddha and represents a turning point in his journey. Quote, the Buddha has robbed me, thought Siddhartha. He has robbed me, yet he has given me something of greater value. He has robbed me of my friend who believed in me and who now believes in him. He was my shadow and is now Gautama's shadow, but he has given to me Siddhartha, myself. The addition of the foreshadow archetype into the greater lexicon of depth psychology will not be some missing key which suddenly unlocks the true meaning behind enigmatic works like Siddhartha. But Serrano is right. Hesse seems to have been held captive by a single, vitally significant theme. What is more, this central theme continually hits at the concept and eventually the vocabulary of Jungian psychology. In Shadow and Self, Selected Papers in Analytical Psychology, Joseph Henderson indicates that this is no coincidence. Quote, Hesse was thought to have had a Jungian analysis, perhaps with Jung himself, at some point in his life in the 1920s. It is said that he had some sort of breakdown before he went back to writing novels. My theory about Hesse is that he probably did have a real psychological problem and severe psychotic, semi-psychotic, or acutely neurotic episodes of some kind. He went to an analyst, maybe Jung, and as soon as he experienced his creative center, he found his archetypal material, and the subject of his next novel appeared. The writing of the novel was his cure. What archetypal material revealed itself to Hesse in his Dark Night of the Soul? Yes, it was surely in the same conceptual sandbox as those other great treatises on the duality of man, but he was not simply parroting the themes of Stevenson and Goethe. Right down to the names of his novels, Hesse gave voice to the shadow archetype in a way that even the greats before him could not. In Steppenwolf and Damien, he illustrates the struggle between ego and shadow, which is common to us all. But in Siddhartha, he tells a story that is far more rare, though no less important. Siddhartha embodies the transcendent potential of the shadow archetype that has long been overlooked. As a foreshadow figure, he paves a new and darker path which nevertheless leads to enlightenment and prepares the way for the arrival of the self. Quote, this mask-like smile, this smile of unity over the flowing forms, this smile of simultaneousness over the thousands of births and deaths, the smile of Siddhartha was exactly the same as the calm, delicate, impenetrable, perhaps gracious, perhaps mocking, wise, thousandfold smile of Gautama the Buddha.